And now it's my pleasure, and I already see you on the screen, that's wonderful, to introduce Dr. Lara Christensen to you. She speaks to us from Australia, and she will talk about exploring female involvement in offline and online sexual offending, gender and age analysis of criminal justice systems interactions. She has extensive expertise in the prevention of response to sexual violence and abuse. She holds a PhD in psychology with a research focus in forensic psychology, and she is the co-leader of Australia's first university-led sexual violence research and prevention unit. She works as a senior lecturer in Criminology and Justice at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Australia. So we have a lot of sunshine here as well, but we are very glad to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for welcoming me into the room virtually today. And while I wish I could be there with you in person, I'm grateful for the opportunity to join you from afar and contribute to this very important conference. And I've been really enjoying watching it online, so thank you. Now, I'm co-leader, as you know, of the Sexual Violence Research and Prevention Unit at the University of the Sunshine Coast. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I'm joining you from on the Sunshine Coast in Australia, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. And in Australia, this is a practice we do to honour the enduring connection of Indigenous peoples to the land. So I'll be presenting findings on a recent paper my colleagues and I co-authored and published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence that really explored the engagement of females in both offline and online sexual offending and how they were dealt with in the justice system. And it's important to mention that female-perpetrated sexual offending, particularly by juveniles, so young people, remains under-recognised and I think under-researched, and also often mischaracterised solely through the lens of victimhood rather than as this complex behavioural issue that requires safeguarding attention. And I want to acknowledge right up front, and I think it was alluded to earlier, that this is a heavy and often uncomfortable topic, but it's also a necessary one because, as you know, safeguarding, it's not just about identifying harm, it's about understanding how it happens, who's involved, and how systems can respond better. And so the aim of this presentation, it's not to sensationalize, it's not to stigmatize, but to inform, to shed light on under-researched patterns in female-perpetrated sexual offences, to understand how age and gender shape these offences, and to consider what this means for justice, prevention and protection. And so throughout the next half hour, I really invite you to listen with both curiosity and care. So what I'll do, I'll start by providing you with a bit of background in terms of how our study came to fruition and what really motivated us to focus on this topic. So just briefly, while sexual violence, it has been extensively studied, we know that one area that remains significantly under-researched is female-perpetrated sexual offences, particularly those cases involving child sexual abuse material, or CSAM, as it's commonly referred to. And so this gap in the literature, it's not accidental. It reflects this, this deeply ingrained gender stereotypes that view women as natural caregivers, inherently nurturing and passive, rather than as individuals who, as we know, are capable of committing acts of sexual violence. And these assumptions shape not only some academic inquiry, but also how some professionals and the public may perceive and even respond to female-perpetrated harm. And so in terms of prevalence. I won't go into it too much because colleagues earlier have spoken about this, but the evidence increasingly suggests that female-perpetrated sexual offending is more common than once believed. And while official crime statistics tend to show low rates of female-perpetrated sexual offending, victimisation surveys, which rely on those self-reports rather than police data, often reveal much higher levels of involvement. And so this discrepancy, it raises important questions about underreporting, misclassification, and even potential bias that may contribute to the visibility, or rather the invisibility, of these offences in the formal justice system. Moreover, now when we look at child sexual abuse material offending, this specific form of offending, most of the existing scholarship has focused almost exclusively on male perpetrators. So research has explored, men's motivations, access to this material, pathways into the offending, whether through possession, distribution, or even production of the child abuse material. But it remains poorly understood when it comes to females. But emerging data suggests that women may be involved in child sexual abuse material more frequently than previously thought. It's also important to consider the impact of these offences, right? So some victim accounts describe abuse by women, particularly maternal figures, as uniquely harmful due to the violation of trust and the conflict it creates with societal expectations of female caregiving. And so this really adds another layer of trauma that is not always accounted for in traditional abuse narratives or support services. Within the criminal justice system, most gender-focused research has concentrated on sentencing disparities, often highlighting, how women receive more lenient punishments than men of similar crimes. But very little attention has been paid to those earlier stages of justice processing, such as arrest. So these pre-trial processes play a critical role in shaping those later case outcomes and public perceptions. And yet we know little about how they differ in terms of gender in child sexual abuse material cases. So our study, it sought to address these gaps by analysing nearly a decade of police data to better understand how gender, age, and offence type intersect to influence law enforcement responses. So by focusing on this under-examined stage in the justice process, we aim to contribute a more nuanced understanding of sexual offending. So let's get to the actual data that we used. So this research was conducted from data in one Australian jurisdiction. We used police data collected over a period from 2012 to 2021. So as I mentioned before, this gave us almost a decade's worth of information to analyse. And we had a strong sample size, nearly 38,000 cases of sexual offences perpetrated by males and females, allowing us to detect meaningful patterns. Now, our study focused on both offline and online sexual offences. So all sexual offences that had come to the attention of the police over almost 10 years. Now, offences, we classified them in 4 ways based on victim age and the offence setting. So one was offline child sexual abuse offences. So this included sexual offences against a child victim. The next one was offline sexual assault offences. So this included sexual offences against an adult or in some instances a victim of an unspecified age. The third category was online assaultive child sexual abuse material offences. So this included involving a child in making the child abuse material. And finally, online non-assaultive child sexual abuse offences. And this included using the internet to procure a child and or expose a child to an indecent act. And so by separating the offences in this way, we were able to compare different patterns of behaviour. So again, a core aim of our research was to further current knowledge of female-perpetrated sexual offences that enter the criminal justice system. And in particular, we sought to learn more about the prevalence of sexual offending and the types of sexual offences perpetrated, whether there is a relationship between perpetrator gender, their age, the types of offences perpetrated, and the likelihood of action taken by law enforcement. So, for example, did juveniles, those aged 10 to 17 years, did they face different types of intervention compared with adults? Or were female offenders treated the same way as male offenders within the criminal justice system? So these kinds of questions are important because they really help us to identify just the nature of offending, but also the challenges, the disparities that the justice system face when dealing with female offenders. And that in turn, it has major implications, right, for how we approach safeguarding and prevention. And so please know what I'm offering today, it's not a definitive conclusion, but I feel it's a step forward. You know, it's a set of data-driven insights that I hope will expand our conversations about safeguarding in the digital age, particularly when it comes to groups who have historically been overlooked. So what do we find in our quantitative analyses? We found that the vast majority of sexual offences were committed by males, making up 88% of all offences compared to 12% by females. And a figure that, while lower, it's still so important to acknowledge, especially given how rarely female-perpetrated sexual offending is discussed in public discourse. And when we broke these offences down by age, we saw that adults were responsible for 67% of offences, while juveniles accounted for 33%. So this shows us that although adult offending dominates in volume, juvenile involvement is still substantial and warrants attention in prevention and response efforts. What was particularly alarming, though, was the breakdown of female-perpetrated sexual offences. So a striking 84% of these offences were committed by juvenile females. So in other words, the vast majority of female offenders in our data set were under the age of 18 years. Additionally, when examining the types of offences committed by females, we found the vast majority, around 3/4, were assaultive child sexual abuse material offences. So this highlights this concerning trend around digital facilitation of abuse and potentially indicates this shift in how female offending is occurring towards technology-enabled crimes. But in comparison, males showed more diversity in their offences, with 3/4 of male-perpetrated offences being offline, but both child sexual abuse and sexual assault. We also found a statistically significant link between gender and offence type, with females predominantly committing online child sexual abuse material offences, while males were more involved in offline offences. So these findings, they really reveal a critical and often overlooked picture of female offending, particularly among youth. That seems to be unfolding in online spaces, and it really raises questions about how we educate, how we supervise, and how we support young people in digital environments, how we structure safeguarding environments to address not just victimisation, but also those harmful sexual behaviours, especially when it comes to individuals that we might not typically expect. I want to now turn our focus to juvenile offenders, and there are some key differences to highlight when it comes to gender. So among the juvenile females, we found that 84% of offences were related to assaultive child sexual abuse material, which might come as a surprise. And another 14% of juvenile female offences involved offline child sexual abuse. Now, in comparison, juvenile males showed a different pattern. Just over half, 52%, committed offline child sexual abuse offences, and about 39% were involved in assaultive child sexual abuse material offences, and a smaller proportion, 8%, committed offline sexual offences. And in fact, you might notice that these percentages don't quite add to 100%. And please know that's intentional. I've left out offence types that make up less than 2% of the sample here, just to keep the slide nice and focused. Now, we also found a moderate statistical significant relationship between gender and offence type for juveniles, meaning gender plays a meaningful role in the types of offences that are committed. So one of the most significant findings, I believe, in our study was that juvenile females were 20 times more likely than adult males and adult females to commit assaultive child sexual abuse material offences. And they were also 8 times more likely than juvenile males to engage in this type of online offending. So this really challenges some traditional assumptions. It also tells us that digital spaces may be influencing how some young females become involved in harmful sexual behaviour. So these findings highlight an urgent need for further research, and understanding the complexities of female offending, especially in this digital age that we live in, is essential if we are to develop more effective interventions and support mechanisms. So now that we've looked at the juvenile offending patterns, I want to turn your attention to the adult offending patterns. And so, as you can see here, adult females, so in terms of adult females, 84% perpetrated offline offences. These were both child sexual abuse and sexual assault. And in terms of males, adult males, 83% perpetrated offline offences as well. So this is quite identical, right, in terms of the males and females. But when we looked more closely at the types of offences, both adult males and adult females, they most commonly committed the offline child sexual abuse against child victims, which was followed by offline sexual assault offences against adult victims. So what I'm getting at is that in contrast to juveniles, especially juvenile females who were heavily represented in online offending, adult offenders were far more likely to be involved in that in-person offending, those contact-based sexual offences. And sure, we still found a statistically significant relationship between gender and offence type for adults. However, the effect size was small. And this tells us that gender may still play a role in offence type in a more consistent way across adult males and adult females than it was among male and female juveniles. So this part of the findings, to me, it seems to challenge an ongoing assumption that adult females are always different to male offenders. In adulthood, at least in this sample, female perpetrated sexual offending closely mirrored male patterns, that adult sample, particularly when it came to the offline nature of their crimes. Let's now turn to how different groups of offenders were handled in the criminal justice system. And this includes things like whether the individual was referred to court or whether, they had no action taken against them. And just for clarity, when I say referred to court, you might be wondering what this term means in case it's different for you. So it's a formal process here in Australia that typically occurs after an arrest where an individual is legally required to attend court, usually through a notice or summons to face charges in front of a judge. And so the findings from our study, they're quite revealing. Adult males were significantly more likely to face formal legal actions such as arrest or being referred to court. And in fact, adult males were the most likely group to be arrested, and referred to court. This really aligns with those traditional patterns of offending. We saw a significantly lower likelihood of arrest for all other groups, for those 3 other groups. So juvenile females, as you can see on the slide, they had the lowest chance of being arrested. They were 98% less likely to be arrested than adult males. Juvenile males were also less likely to be arrested, though not to the same extent. They were 89% less likely compared to adult males. And adult females were 53% less likely to be arrested than adult males. And we saw a very similar pattern when it came to being referred to court. So juvenile females were again 98% less likely to be referred to court compared to adult males. Juvenile males were 90% less likely to face a court referral. And finally, adult females were 46% less likely to be referred to court compared to adult males. So instead, we found that police diversion was much more likely for these groups. Police diversion includes things like community conference, the offender being dealt with by another agency, a restorative justice referral, receiving a caution, etc. Now, understanding the patterns of treatment across these different groups, juvenile females, juvenile males, adult males, is critical for refining our criminal justice responses and ensuring that interventions are both fair and effective. So we need to ensure that offenders, regardless of gender, regardless of age, are held appropriately accountable while also receiving the necessary support to address the underlying causes of their behaviours. And please know, like all studies, ours is not without limitations. You know, this research, it relied on police data, meaning it reflects only those cases that were formally reported and recorded, but it likely underrepresents the true scope of female-perpetrated sexual offending in the community. And in addition, while our sample size was large and, spanned nearly a decade, our focus on age and gender limited our ability to look at other important factors such as ethnicity, cultural background, or sexuality. However, despite these limitations, our study, it offers those important insights. The patterns we identified, particularly around gender and age and offence type, provides a strong evidence base to inform safeguarding strategies. And my hope is that these findings will support more inclusive, context-aware and trauma-informed approaches to preventing harm and responding particularly to young people who come into contact of the justice system. So I invite you to reflect on what our study means for safeguarding strategies moving forward. And so to me, it's clear that there are important safeguarding considerations, a number that have emerged based on this research. And I'd like to focus on 6 key areas with you where I think targeted, informed action can make really meaningful differences here in terms of preventing harm and protecting young people in a digital and real world context. So let's begin with education. So one of the strongest implications of our research is the need to evolve safeguarding education. Traditionally, digital safety programs have focused on how young people can protect themselves from victimization. And sure, while this remains essential, we also need to educate youth on how certain behaviors such as production, possession, or sharing, child sexual abuse material, including self-generated material, may cause harm to them and others. Education programs, they need to be grounded in those realities that young people face online and include ethical, legal, relational discussions about digital behaviour. And many of you may be familiar with Professor Carleen Furman's work on contextual safeguarding, and her work really reminds us that children's behaviours are shaped by the contexts around them, right? Those peer groups, schools, neighbourhoods, online spaces. So our safeguarding efforts must extend beyond the family and respond to the social environments that can really enable or prevent harmful behaviour. And the second area is trauma-informed approaches. So broader research suggests that some people who engage in sexual harm, especially girls, may have experienced abuse, trauma, coercion themselves. And so a trauma-informed safeguarding approach acknowledges that harmful behaviour may emerge in the context of unresolved trauma in some instances. And so by no means this does not excuse the behaviour, but it guides how we respond. And safeguarding strategies must combine accountability with access to therapeutic support and early intervention. And for adolescents in particular, this dual approach may be essential in preventing reoffending and really promoting that recovery. Next is multi-sector collaboration. So effective safeguarding, we know it cannot happen in silos. A shared safeguarding approach that involves, police, educators, social workers, mental health professionals, et cetera, it reduces the risk of those missed warning signs. It enables the chance for those more coordinated, timely interventions. And the fourth area is gender-sensitive practices. So our study revealed marked differences in how juvenile males and juvenile females engage in this behaviour. Female youth were significantly more likely to commit assaultive child sexual abuse material offences. However, if intervention frameworks assume male-perpetrated harm, this risks creating blind spots, right? That leaves certain forms of offending and the young people involved unrecognised and unsupported. So a gender-sensitive safeguarding approach means recognising that both boys and girls may be at risk of causing harm and tailoring those interventions accordingly. The next area of importance is really that proactive monitoring, and I do apologise that my head is currently in the way there. So proactive monitoring, it's one of the most alarming findings in our study was that the involvement of juvenile females in online child sexual abuse material offences. And this is a trend that is under-acknowledged in current research. And so what it suggests is that safeguarding responses must include more proactive identification of harmful digital behaviours. So this includes monitoring school-based digital conduct, training frontline workers to recognise those early warning signs, and ensuring online safety programs evolve in response to emerging trends. So this is essential not only for protecting those potential victims, but also for disrupting the development of harmful behaviour before it might escalate. And finally, we come to family support. We know that families play a crucial role in safeguarding. They are often the first to notice changes in a young person's behaviour, but many feel unprepared to respond, ill-equipped to respond, even though they definitely want to, right? So more practical support is needed for these caregivers to monitor digital activity, recognise when a behaviour might cross a line, and how to have those really difficult conversations in an honest, non-judgmental and informed way. And so this could include, digital literacy workshops, guides on app monitoring and privacy settings, or even something as simple as community-based parenting programs that focus specifically on sexual development, online risks, respectful relationships. So together, I see that these 6 areas can contribute toward a safeguarding framework. So through our study, identifying those patterns of youth who engage in sexual offences, we're able to identify considerations for those more inclusive, responsive, and preventative safeguarding strategies, particularly for those young females. And so I see that there are several important avenues for future research that have emerged from our study. So first of all, our findings, they underscore the importance of investigating pathways that lead juveniles, particularly females, to engage in this offending. So this demographic, as I keep saying, it has been historically underrepresented in offender-focused research. And their involvement, it really raises important and complex questions about motivation, coercion, and agency. So for instance, to what extent is this child sexual abuse material involving these female juveniles actually self-generated? And if it is, does it stem from coercive victimization or peer pressure or misguided attempts at, intimacy and acceptance amongst their peer group? So these distinctions are crucial as they may reflect very different underlying psychosocial dynamics and risk factors. But of course, at the same time, we must not overlook the possibility that some of the cases may involve deliberate harm to other children, suggesting potential malicious intent among a subset of these female juveniles. So by gaining a clearer understanding of these diverse pathways, we can really develop more targeted, developmentally appropriate responses, and early identification of risk factors and tailored interventions could help prevent offending and provide necessary support for at-risk youth. Second of all, looking forward, intersectionality must be a part of future research. So gender, culture, sexual orientation can potentially influence how young people experience and engage in sexual offences, and exploring these factors in more detail could help us create more tailored and effective safeguarding strategies, ones that are truly inclusive of the and responsive to the needs of all young people, regardless of their background and identity. And finally, this research, it should not be seen in isolation. Replication of these findings across different jurisdictions, both within Australia, internationally, will help validate these patterns and enhance our understanding of youth offending on a global scale. And it will also help us build a more comprehensive evidence-based framework for safeguarding that can be applied across potentially a range of contexts. So in sum, our study doesn't just identify key patterns of offending, but also underscores the need for forward-thinking, intersectional approaches to safeguarding, particularly for juvenile offenders who are often overlooked in these discussions. And so this research, I believe it offers a platform for building inclusive, preventive, and proactive safeguarding systems that really attempt to protect youth from harm, both as potential victims and offenders. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I don't know if I've finished a few minutes early, which is exciting for you all, so you can have a coffee earlier than potentially what you're planning. But on this slide, on your left, you'll find a QR code that will take you directly to the publication that I've just presented on. And additionally, on the right-hand side, sorry, no, I'm not even going to attempt to point. Sorry about that. And on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll find the QR code that will take you directly to our Sexual Violence Research and Prevention Unit, which I co-lead. And you're more than welcome to sign up to our newsletters, which provide some of the latest research in this field and the projects that we're working on. So we'd absolutely love to keep you informed and connected. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.